In previous videos, we've explored ways of using fingering to create distinct groups of notes. We showed that by shifting hand position between those groups of notes, we're able to convey to our listeners something about the meter or perhaps the musical gesture. But what about the notes within a given figure or a given gesture? How should we go about articulating those notes? And in particular, how should we think about articulating those notes within a sweet and tender piece like Bach's E major Prelude from Book I of the WTC? So, how should we go about playing notes that fit together within one gesture? Well, of course, like in all things in music, there is a wide diversity of opinion about this, but I think, especially in tender pieces like this one, that we should try to connect these notes together. What do I mean then by connect them together? Well, let's dig a little deeper. One of the signs that composers have used throughout history to indicate that groups of notes belong together or should be connected in some way is the slur. That curvy line that connects a group of notes, however long or short, from one spot on the page to another. How should we actually articulate the notes under the slur? Well, we could look in a variety of places for an answer. But for me, perhaps the clearest and easiest answer comes from Jean-Philippe Rameau. In fact, it comes from a treatise and ornament table published along with a collection of harpsichord pieces in 1724, the Pièce de clavecin avec une méthode. What we find here is a pretty clear explanation of how to execute a slur. And so this is what he says, that a slur that embraces two different notes indicates that the finger must not be raised from the first note until after the second note has been played. Now, we could potentially interpret that in a couple of different ways. Saying that one must only lift the first finger after the second has played doesn't actually tell us a whole lot. Which is why, looking a little bit more closely at Rameau's ornament table, we get a potential answer to this in the form of his explanation for how to play the porte-voix and the coulet, two ornaments that, nearly by definition, connect notes together. And indeed, if we look at the ornament table, he shows by tying over the first note for roughly half the value of the second note, that you have to hold that note down while you play the second note. And only after the second note has already sounded for a little bit of time, we can then release that first note. Here's the porte-voix, which, without knowing any better, we might play like this. But Rameau tells us actually needs to be played. So that temporary rub between B and C is a key part of the expressive power of this particular ornament and the expressive power of over legato more generally. So that covers the case of two notes connected together by a slur, but what about when we have many notes that are connected under a slur? Again, Rameau has the answer. He says, a slur that embraces many notes indicates that one must hold them all down from one end of the slur to the other. And here's what those notes under the slur sound like. which obviously sounds a whole lot more resonant and full than the alternative. In fact, I think what Rameau is describing for us here as these two different ways of playing a slur are what we now tend to refer to as first over legato and second overholding. And while both of these ideas are very closely related, and in fact it might seem a little bit fussy to distinguish them with these different terms, I think it's helpful to keep them separate in our minds. Overholding is primarily, if we think about Rameau's example under the long slur, it's a manner of connecting different notes that belong together under the same harmony. Over legato, on the other hand, isn't connecting notes together that belong as part of the same harmony. Actually, since these notes are a step apart, they are quite dissonant with one another. Instead, it's creating a kind of color or shading of those notes. And in fact, it creates the effect of making the second note that gets played a little bit softer than the first note. This will all hopefully be a whole lot clearer when we see how this all works in Bach's Prelude. So let's see about that now. If I take the opening of the Prelude, it begins in the right hand with an arpeggiated gesture. And in fact, I could choose to articulate each of those notes with something like ordinary touch, perhaps making a slightly bigger articulation before the final E on top as a way of showing its arrival on a stronger beat. But I think perhaps a better approach would be to understand that these notes, as part of one gesture, should be connected together as if they fall under a slur, which might mean then that I play the line instead like this. Now, personally, I think also in cases like this that we can have our cake and eat it too, in that we can overhold many of these notes that form the E major harmony, but still create articulation at key moments. And so for me, I think the key moment where we want to have articulation is when the B goes to the E. So the way that I would play this then is like this. Or maybe even. So I'm overholding all of those E major notes that we heard at the beginning of the bar and just articulating from the B to the E so that we get that quality of arrival on the high E. But again, this is all really up to individual taste of the player. So if we combine that with the left hand, so far so good. Now, however, we have a line that's moving by step. And so again, I think probably the best approach here is to connect those notes together, those 3/8 notes that belong together as one unit, with some over legato. So what does that mean then? Well, we're going to hold the E even after we played the D sharp, and then perhaps lift the E, and then we're going to hold the D sharp while we play the E, and then lift the D sharp. So I have I could, I suppose, go slightly more extreme and try and hold all of these notes as long as possible. But I often think that's not the best thing to do when playing over legato because it actually ends up sounding a little bit bland. All of these notes being equally long have equal weight. Each note is also equally loud and soft. So instead, I think a better approach is to think about this almost like shading. We want different degrees of over legato from note to note. And so what I might do perhaps is hold the first E quite long into the D sharp, and then hold the D sharp less long. So I get something like, or. Let's connect that together with the opening. I can now do exactly the same thing here. And again, I'm making a nice articulation at the end of the figure, leading to the high E, and creating over legato within the figure. Let's now see how all of this fits together, and see if you can notice at any given moment whether over legato or overholding is being applied.